Let me welcome our speaker today, Gergely Kertész. He's a research fellow at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences and an honorary fellow in the Department of Philosophy at Durham University. And he works on emergence, reduction, and causation, among other things. And very fortunately, we have managed to convince him to rekindle his interest in the philosophy of biology for this project on teleology. And he's going to talk about teleology, goal-directedness, and self-organization, how to best revive teleology in the context of biology.
I will pursue a behavioral account of goal-directedness, and in this case, goal-directedness will be a kind of analysis of teleology. The main argument that I will try to answer against such accounts is the argument that the behavior-centered view is too wide. It includes too much. It cannot exclude obvious cases where intuitively an entity is not goal-directed. The behavior of the entity is not goal-directed, and that's a problem. The main question is how to differentiate a kind of simple directedness, we could call it some fundamental directedness, as in physical sciences you can find examples for this, and real goal-directedness or simply goal-directedness. So I will basically talk about directedness and goal-directedness, which is not the same thing. Directedness means a kind of directed behavior. On my account, this is only a sketch now, that is plastic in a sense that I will clarify in a moment, and extrinsic. While goal-directedness is a kind of directed behavior that is plastic, persistent, and intrinsic to the entity that behaves in a certain way. So what is persistence? Because that's the real difference maker in this whole project. The proposal, the crucial point for the proposal is what persistence is. And it's the notion of self-governance that I use here comes from the old general systems theory literature. So a persistent behavior is based on some kind of self-governance, which includes two things basically. First, there's a kind of self-produced motion that belongs to the entity that persists in pursuing its goal. And that motion is directed towards the goal. This is only preliminary now, so I will refine this definition and I will show a lot of examples later. But to be able to be as clear as I can be now, I will constrain the discussion of behavior to the context of motion behavior, because that's quite clear. The examples can be treated in a quite straightforward manner. So let's see. This is also just a sketch, but the distinction will be something like this. There's directedness, which is an extrinsic matter, and there's goal-directedness, that's an intrinsic matter. Directedness of a body, and just think about very simple kinetic systems now. So the directedness of a body accelerating towards the center of gravity is not intrinsic to it. It is present only in relation to that center of gravity. The same is true about its acceleration and momentum. Why? If the contrast will show you why. The momentum is a vector quantity, so the direction part is included in the momentum. So that explains the momentum part. And the acceleration is basically produced by gravity in this case. But that's not the only possible source of acceleration. And there are some forms of acceleration that can be treated as intrinsic to an entity that accelerates. So let's turn to cases where this might be the case. But the directedness of a body leaving the Earth's atmosphere, like a rocket or something, is, sorry, I can't see my own monitor because of this Zoom window. Yeah, so the directedness of a body leaving the Earth's atmosphere is at least partially intrinsic to it. Its acceleration and momentum going upwards is at least partially self-produced. It's based on the release of internally stored energy. So if our entity, behaving entity, is a rocket, it stores internal energy, and the release of this energy, which is internal to that system originally, creates the acceleration, and that acceleration in a sense is intrinsic to that body. So this is just an outline for my approach. But let's see in a bit more focused way how what is the context in cybernetics and how is this whole thing connected to teleology and stuff. So I basically went back to read some early cybernetics, and one of the best texts to read on this was to read Bertalanffy. He basically tried to differentiate between living systems and non-living systems, and try to avoid vitalism in this process, and basically said that okay, living systems compared to non-living systems are goal-directed. And he introduced this idea of a self-governing system that is goal-directed, but his approach and his definition of self-governance was based on the mechanisms for goal-directedness. So it was basically based on discussion of feedback mechanisms and stuff like that. It was most of the discussions in cybernetics and early cybernetics are a bit confused in this respect. So they confuse mechanistic approaches with behavioral approaches and stuff like that. This is something I won't do. I will concentrate on the behavioral part, but I will utilize this notion of self-governance because I think it can be treated as an ability of a system without saying anything about the underlying mechanisms of the internal structure of the system. So how is this whole thing connected to teleology or teleological explanation? Well, teleological explanations explain the existence of an entity or behavior, maybe a property. And certain behaviors, the behaviors we are interested in here, are best explained by the goal-directedness of the entity performing the behavior. And in the scenarios I will analyze here, to see exactly what we will see. There's an inspiration for my general approach that comes from developmental psychology and some really good researchers at the CEU, Gergely and his team worked a lot on a kind of psychological stance they call the teleological stance. You can identify this this kind of thing from early infancy, and the team, the research group, tried to pinpoint those features or those clues infants utilize to identify systems that should be interpreted in a kind of teleological manner. And there are three things they we identified. First, there's featural or appearance-based approach in early childhood and even in adulthood. So basically, we suppose that systems that resemble us are probably goal-directed because we think that we are goal-directed. There's more to this, but it doesn't really matter for us now. There's this other thing where we see something that has self-produced motion, or it can produce motion without any kind of external perturbation. And then we single out those things as good candidates for being goal-directed systems. It's not enough in itself, either of these, by the way, but this is another clue that from early infancy people rely on. And there's the third one, the variability of behavior. We see an entity that has a really complex kind of behavior, then we also suppose that probably this system or this entity has goal-directedness. And they say that the single most important behavior of you for identifying a goal-directed agent is variability of behavior. So there's a kind of tendency in human beings and from early childhood to somehow overgeneralize in this respect. What we do basically is we infer goal-directedness usually from behavior, first and foremost. And then when we accepted that the system is basically goal-directed, it helps us to predict the behavior. That's what basically happens, or we try to rely on this presupposition to predict behavior. It doesn't mean that we don't use the other cues or we don't rely on other things, or that there is nothing more to this, but these are the basic features we attend to. And interestingly, there's this bias towards goal attribution in humans. So the variability of behavior is over-relied on as a heuristic, which has an interesting parallel with the discussion of the same feature, this so-called plasticity of behavior in cybernetics. And basically, the account Daniel spelled out that was based on Braithwaite's approach has the same feature. So it's basically an account that relies solely on the variability of behavior. And I think that's not enough. And it's not enough for human beings in general either. Even though we have this cognitive bias towards this feature, it's just not enough to do to make proper distinction and to do proper identification. So let me try to summarize my proposal. So I will call this account naturalized teleology, and I will admit that basically I'm following the footsteps of Braithwaite again, but I will add certain things. So what is goal-directedness? On my account, it's reducible, but it doesn't matter, but plastic, persistent, and intrinsic directedness. So what are these things? Plasticity is a feature according to which the same end can be achieved from a variety of different starting points by the entity of question. So Daniel had this example in his talk where there's a rat that has to find a piece of food in a maze. We can put rat to different ends of the maze, and it will get to the same point where the food is. That's the basic example. But that's not really enough, because as we saw, there are some basic physical systems that are intuitively not goal-directed. in the required sense, and those show the same kind of behavior in many scenarios. So there are counterexamples. If you only rely on plasticity, you end up with a lot of counterexamples. So let's introduce another thing, another criterion, persistence. What is persistence? Persistence is tending towards the goal in the face of obstacles. And I think this requires at least two things: self-produced motion. Interestingly, this is something that the psychologists identified. Some of the early cybernetics talked about, but it's not mentioned in more contemporary summaries or overviews of the same literature. So it requires self-produced motion and the ability to maneuver. Some later cybernetists tried to introduce some ideas that are quite similar to my idea of maneuvering, as you will see. And then the last thing is intrinsicness, where this directedness is, the entity is directed in virtue of the way it is, because of its internal features. We can also say that its the intrinsicness of this goal-directedness means that every duplicate of the entity is directed in the same way, at least in nomologically possible words. Just to go back to this model of a configuration space, again, that Daniel utilized to formulate his account. So in his example, I think I can use my cursor here. So in his example, the configuration space was a kind of one-dimensional thing. On this axis, you saw the position of the rat. On the other one, the position of the goal the rat tries to achieve. This is a really good depiction of many possible behaviors. It's really simple, and it really allows a lot of interesting scenarios. So if the goal and the target of the behavior is fixed, is placed somewhere in the middle of the maze, for example, then an arrow like this black arrow signifies the approach of the rat. So this midline is a line that signifies that the entity that approaches and the target are at the same place. So basically here the rat approaches the food and arrives at the food. But there are some other scenarios where the target can move. For example, hunters and their prey might have this kind of relation where the hunter pursues the prey and prey is moving and trying to leave the hunter behind. So there's the successful version of it, and the red arrow, and there's an unsuccessful version of it. The yellow arrow signifies such a scenario. In both cases, the target moves. Now, I do agree that this is a really good basic model in which you can talk about the possible patterns of behavior. And I agree with Daniel that those trajectories in this configuration space that end in the reaching of the goal form a natural resemblance class. Or that should be a good basic model. This can even include scenarios where the goal is not reached by the entity that's considered to be goal-directed. The unsuccessful pursuit is such a scenario. So in such a scenario, the position of epsilon, the position of the hunter or the rat, whatever, is determined by the goal, and it's determined in a quite straightforward fashion, even though the target is never reached. But my claim is that this model is not rich enough to include persistence. One-dimensionality obscures the complexity of movement that characterizes persistent movement or persistent pursuit of goals. So in terms of motion persistence, so if we talk about motion persistence, we talk about a self-produced motion that is utilized for maneuvering towards the goal, even if the goal changes its position or an obstacle comes and moves between the goal and the entity that pursues it. So persistence is a complex behavior in the face of obstacles. That's the basic idea. And let's see some counterexamples from the literature. So I will only go through some of the most repeated ones, those that people really like to utilize against the goal-directedness account that we talk about. So one is the behavior of a pendulum. So we all know this from physics class, so it's not really a complicated issue. I can simply say that, okay, there's plasticity in the behavior of the pendulum. The 1 and 2 scenarios, 1 and 2 are different in terms of starting position of the pendulum, but the end state in the middle is the same in both cases. So it's true that there's plasticity. You can also say that this plastic behavior is not too complex, but it doesn't really matter. So it fits the definition. But if we include this further criterion of persistence, we can see that it seems that we can at least differentiate between this kind of scenarios and more interesting intuitive scenarios of goal-directedness. So the third scenario is such that I introduced an obstacle to the pendulum. And the pendulum can't do anything about the obstacle, it stops there. It becomes the end state of the system. The pendulum rests on the obstacle. And we can imagine a scenario where somehow this obstacle is avoided by the pendulum, but that would require some extra energy in the system. And all the energy in the system comes from the potential energy that was introduced externally by an initial push or just bringing it up to a certain position. So if persistent behavior and the presence of obstacles is important, it seems that pendulums can be really thrown out. This is not a good example of plastic persistent behavior. Another example that comes up in the literature quite a lot is a funnel in which some balls are rolling towards the very same point in the bottom. And similarly, it's a plastic behavior. There are different starting points, and the balls end up in the same hole. However, when we can see that if you introduce an obstacle like that V-shaped obstacle on the side of the funnel, that might stop a ball and the ball has no chance of getting around this obstacle. So it will stay there. The source of motion for this for these balls is incoming momentum and gravity that brings them down on the side of the slope, on the side of the funnel. There's no extra energy that can be introduced by the gray ball, so it stands no chance of moving around the obstacle and getting into the hole. So this example can be thrown out as well. Now, sorry, I just have to replace my window. So let's see some more complex system again with an obstacle, and I will compare this to a scenario where presumably real goal-directedness takes place. So imagine that we see a kind of a mountainside or a slope on which a ball comes down, it faces an obstacle, and then it just rolls down towards a valley or something like that, the bottom of the slope, which is a center of gravity, a kind of lowest point in the environment. The first obstacle can be just the entity can go around the first obstacle. There's enough energy for that, so that the friction created by the obstacle and the rolling ball or whatever is small enough, so the pull of gravity can bring the ball down. But then it faces a concave obstacle on the way down, and that obstacle stops it right there. And what really stops it is basically the pull of gravity. So to be able to avoid this obstacle, we would need energy that can withstand the pull of gravity in this case. So I think I'm justified in saying that the features of the motion of the ball are basically extrinsic in the sense that even though the mass of the ball is an intrinsic property of it, pull of gravity, the acceleration created by the pull of gravity, is not intrinsic to the ball. Everything that happens is created by this extrinsic force. It's extrinsic because it only appears in the presence of certain external relations. And then at some point it seems to stop, and what we would expect from a goal-directed system is to be able to do something more than this. So we would expect it to be able to somehow maneuver this situation. And a quite, I think, realistic picture would be something like this. So even though this goal is still a kind of center of gravity in the sense that the entity that goes down on the slope utilizes the pulling force of gravity. The reason why it can get there in the face of the concave obstacle is that it has the ability to produce energy internally, and this internally produced energy and its ability to direct this internally produced energy allows it to get around the obstacle. You can imagine many similar kind of scenarios, but that's the basic kind of difference maker I want to talk about. There are many possible versions of this, but I think this is the real difference maker. So let's see how the amended account would look like. So the real difference maker in the new proposal is the kind of behavior when facing obstacles. So goal-directed behavior is quite special compared to a simple directed behavior. It includes a kind of self-produced maneuvering towards the goal. And so it's basically two things that can be, I think, separated as abilities. So release of internally stored energy to create motion is one aspect of it, and second is the ability to maneuver, the ability to use the self-produced motion to get closer to the goal, determine the direction of movement. It's not fully determined in most cases by the internally stored energy, but it is determined at least partially, and that's for us. So on this account, goal-directedness comes in degrees, in the sense that different goal-directed entities can be different in the sense that they might have different degrees of these abilities, different degrees of goal-directedness. So some goal-directed entities might be able to maneuver around obstacles in a lot of situations, other maybe in only a small amount of situations. But what we need to look for when we want to know whether a system is goal-directed or not is those situations. And we should be able to test the behavior of an entity in such situations. I just brought some test scenarios that might have to think about these things. So these test scenarios are such that we can see that this really differentiate the criteria I emphasized, really differentiate between simple directedness and real goal directedness. So test case one is inert motion that achieves a goal. It can be, for example, free fall. I can just let my body to fall down somewhere, and that by doing that I can achieve my goal. So it might even be an intended kind of free fall. So but when can we say that the system that behaves this way is goal-directedness? Not based on this example, for sure. So such free fall is not a proof of goal-directedness. Sorry, I think that's not right what I wrote here, but let me correct myself. So this system is goal-directedness if it could change its behavior to match changes in the behavior of the goal, even when it faces obstacles in the way. So if we can move to counterfactual situations where there are some obstacles in the way, and we can see that the entity, or I myself, maybe I can be a subject in this case as well, I can avoid the obstacle and I can follow the goal, then that's a proof for my goal-directedness, or for the entity's goal-directedness. But this behavior in itself, and definitely it can be simple directed behavior. Just based on this example, it can be a simple directed system or a goal-directed system as well. We need to test counterfactual situations to be able to decide on the goal-directedness of the system. Test case 2, inert motion gets stuck because of an obstacle. So what we see is similar to what we already saw in one of the pictures. You can see this below. And So we can test this again. This particular behavior might signify or might suggest that this system is not goal-directed. This is true if the end state is determined extrinsically, basically, and there is no counterfactual where the ball gets through or around a similar obstacle. But in case there are some counterfactual situations where the same ball can get around some similar obstacle or can get through the obstacle, then that's interesting. Getting through the obstacle means something like this. We fix the obstacle and we move to a counterfactual world where this ball shows the ability of producing some extra energy that accelerates it to a higher momentum, which, for example, crashes the obstacle. But that energy is extra energy brought into the system by this entity. And then that's an interesting counterfactual scenario for us. Again, you can see a quite similar scenario where the ball, what we see is that the ball demolishes, crashes through an obstacle. And if this is simply an extrinsically determined collision that ends up crushing the obstacle, then it's not interesting. Because if you make the obstacle more resistant, move to a counterfactual situation with a more resistant obstacle, then you won't get this result. Because the ball has no extra energy to release to be able to accelerate itself and to be able to do the same. I will skip one of the examples there, and just a last test case where there's pressurized bottle that wears through, and the gas outflow moves the bottle towards the goal, towards X. But the bottle is not goal-directed if there is no maneuvering towards the goal in counterfactual situations. So first we can simply test whether it would follow the goal, the presumed goal, and then we can also test what the bottle does if we bring an obstacle between the bottle and its presumed goal. And then we can decide whether this is a goal-directed system. But if we take a physical system like our pressurized bottle that wears through, we will end up with a decision of the system not being goal-directed. So let me summarize the amended proposal. So my criteria for goal-directedness of behavior is plastic and persistent intrinsic directedness. And I think what's really nice about this approach is that this can be spelled out in terms of abilities. So one can remain fairly neutral with respect to the internal structure of the goal-directed system. So we don't have to talk about mechanisms, don't have to talk about feedback mechanisms or anything like that. And this complex ability can be tested by manipulations on the goal and on obstacles between the system, the entity and obstacles. The crucial point is that the solution requires this ability of self-governance on the side of the entity. This is what I also put persistence, so, which has basically two sub-abilities: self-generated motion and the ability to maneuver towards the goal. And these these two abilities be intrinsic to the entity. I think that can be the case. I just try to sketch kind of epistemology for testing goal-directedness. This is not a too serious kind of proposal, just to think about it. So what do we do? The whole thing is motivated by the work of Chibra and others, the psychology department. So first, we see a kind of variable behavior. It draws our attention to itself. We hypothesize that the entity is goal-directed. We hypothesize that the entity has something as a goal, something that we see in the environment and seems plausible. And then we test for changes in the behavior that cover with interventions on the goal. And then we test for changes in the behavior that cover with interventions into the context, environment. Basically, the really important aspect is the introduction of obstacles into the environment. So if we see enough persistence in these tests, enough persistence and plasticity, then we rightfully infer that X is the goal and the system is goal-directed. If the test fails, we might try different hypothetical goals. So we might try to go for other candidates in this respect, but probably after doing a few rounds, we would be able to exclude that entity, or not. Maybe we can find a goal that really explains the goal-directed, seemingly goal-directed behavior of the entity. So that's basically it. Just a few objections that are really regularly raised in the literature. So basically, I try to answer the objection according to which goal-directedness cannot be defined in a way that doesn't include too much. I don't think that that's right. Some people raise the objection that the definitions, for example, the original definition of great right, cannot account for failures of reaching the goal. I think that's not really an important issue, and I already tried to allude this when I analyzed the configuration space early in this talk. So I think it's enough that the behavior of a system is determined by a goal. It doesn't have to reach the goal. And then we can also talk about situations where there's no goal present, and then but I don't think that the omission of a goal is really interesting, because we simply have to go to counterfactual situations to check whether the system in question is goal-directed or not in any meaningful sense. So thank you for your goal-directed attention, and that's my talk today.
Thank you, Gergely. That was extremely interesting. We already have a question from Elena. Reducibility is a feature of the view on naturalized teleology that you propose. Could you say more about the ways in which your account is reductive? Would goal-directed behavior be reducible to biological processes, for example, natural selection, or physical processes?
I don't think that natural selection is really important here. Goal-directedness is not a feature of living things. Well, not only a feature of living things. It can be a feature of a robot. It can be a feature of artificial systems as well. And that's something that was already discussed in the old cybernetics literature. I think it's reducible in some way to mechanisms, the kind of mechanisms that even biologists but also cybernetics people try to identify. But I just don't really know which are the most important ones, or more importantly, I wouldn't be able to answer those who say that, for example, feedback mechanisms are not essential for such kind of behavior. Maybe they are right, I just don't know. But even if such kind of behavior is multiply realized by feedback mechanisms and other kinds of mechanisms, I think basically it should be reducible to some kind of mechanism.
Would then your view be vulnerable to objections regarding conflating living beings with artifacts? For example, how would you explain the fact that the behavior of living beings is not constrained in the same way as that of artificial entities?
Well, I think this depends on your examples. So there are really simple living beings and there are really complex artificial systems. And I think they are comparable in this respect. So I think the distinction that you're relying on in the question is basically illusory. I'm not entirely sure about this, but this is really what I think at the moment. So I do think that artificial systems and living systems are comparable in this respect and can be goal-directed. And then there's another one from Sylvia Leschan. How can you differentiate between a random movement maneuvering and a goal-directed one? Should we just simply calculate the distribution of movement and make calculations?
Conclusions.
Yeah, sorry, conclusions. Can an entity be goal-directed? But assuming it's blind in senses, just moves randomly, so we can't tell if it acts goal-directed or not. I really like the second part of the question. So, well, I think this is basically all the same. So we are talking about random movement, and your question is, if I'm correct, is that is whether random movement can be goal-directed or not. Is that right? If it is, what do you mean by random here? So if your goal is, and in evolutionary contexts, you can imagine such kind of potential goals. If your goal is simply to move and to find some sources of food that are quite randomly distributed on land, then your basically random movement is not some Brownian motion or whatever, can be a quite efficient kind of thing, but it's self-produced and it's directed in a way that matches the pattern of the goal. The pattern of the goal is random on land, and your behavior matches that pattern, and it's self-produced.
Can I have a follow-up on Sylvia's?
Yeah, definitely.
Or I mean, maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, but I'm thinking of a scenario like this. So suppose I want to get food, but I have a brain seizure, so I cannot move. One could say that I still have a goal. It's just that I'm at the moment unable to do anything in order to realize it.
Yeah, that's true. I wouldn't say that I can account for this. Well, I can't account for having a goal in general. That's not something I can really explain here. What I can explain is certain kind of behavior, and this is what I said in the beginning of the talk. So certain kinds of behavior are best explained by the goal-directedness of the system. That's what I basically said at the beginning. And in this respect, you can also say that these entities that behave in required manner are teleological. So the motion you see, the motion they produce, is somehow determined by a goal, and by nothing else, really.
This is a question from Jacopo. Really interesting, thanks. I wonder if you could expand on the teleological stance from early infancy. Is the idea that children are more inclined than adults to attribute goal-directedness to objects? Piaget seemed to suggest something similar when he observed that children tend to perceive a ball moving in a plane as having desires or goals. If so, could goal-directedness be more of a subjective notion, with people perceiving something as goal-directedness or not, according to their level of development?
I think that's a really nice question, but I'm not a developmental psychologist myself. So as far as I understand this literature I refer to, this is more or less the case. So, but there's a slight difference to what you imply in your question, because they don't say that it is only a bias in infancy. It's also a bias in adulthood. There's no, I think this is what they say, but I'm not really an expert on this. So what's really interesting is that children don't really require the feature-based or appearance-based identification. So if they see a box or they see an object moving on a computer screen and it behaves in a certain way, it avoids objects or gets around objects and stuff like that, and the behavior is plastic enough, then they immediately jump to conclusions about the behavior of the objects, and they start to treat it as a kind of goal-directed entity. And then there's an overgeneralization in those cases, seemingly, because they tend to jump to conclusions too early. So they don't do too much testing or stuff like that. But as far as I see, the basic clues they rely on are quite intelligible. So basically, getting around an obstacle is an important clue. It's not dispensable, really. People tend to jump to conclusions even without this clue, but that's really the decisive one. And that's all I know about this. I really can't give you more, but I can direct to you to those papers.
Thank you, Jacopo. Let us know if you have a follow-up. And let me just mention that we're going to have a talk in 2 weeks, I think, by Helen de Cruz, which will probably touch upon these developmental psychological issues.
That's great to know.
I have a follow-up on Elena's earlier follow-up. So the question was, how would you explain the fact that the behavior of living beings is not constrained in the same way as that of artificial entities? And the response was that, well, some artificial entities are extremely complex, whereas some living things are relatively simple. I mean, even if we buy into that, artificially constructed goal-directed systems seem to be, they are typically produced for one specific goal, which they either fulfill or not. But it's not clear that we have the same in the case of living beings. So one could say that, I mean, unless you define it, the goal of all or most living beings or typical living beings as just survival, then maybe it's on the same level as I don't know, a heat-seeking rocket, which can do only one thing, and even that not very intelligently. So can't one still push the claim that there's something? I mean, the potential range of goals in the case of living beings is much wider than in the case of anything artificial.
Well, I think this is a quite tricky empirical question. I think at the moment some people are developing robots over in America,
Mm-hmm.
the Boston Dynamics and stuff like that. Maybe you heard about those companies that are really, really scary in this respect. So they are doing things that were unimaginable like 10 years ago. So the behavior is really varied and multifaceted, if you want. And I don't know, maybe like 100 years ago, this would have been true. I just don't know what happens now. But I don't think that this is an essential kind of difference. So even in the early cybernetics literature, people talked about a kind of second dimension for persistence and plasticity. Basically, they talked about this issue that really usually appears in the case of living systems, that they have different means to reach the same goals. So if one mean cannot reach the goal, they choose another mean to reach the goal, and they can vary the different means according to plan or according to the changes in the environment. So most like, you know, rats in the maze, if you put an obstacle in the maze, then they might try to jump over the wall or do whatever, they try to move the obstacle. And they have many different kinds of means. The simple systems I talked about are simpler than that. There's no variability in terms of means. But I don't think that that's really a kind of you know, fundamental distinction or dimension. Well, I don't see why it be, but it's important. So there are really simple systems where there's only one mean, and in this respect, that there's only one dimension in which you can maneuver, and that's defined by your one available mean.
Mm-hmm. All right. Okay. Thank you. If there are no other questions right now, let me raise another one. So originally, the title of the talk included biology as well, which you said you didn't have time to develop really. Can I ask you just to roughly indicate how you would like to link up this this idea with biology?
Yeah. Okay. So I think what's an important and probably a fundamental distinction between living systems and non-living systems is their capacity to produce themselves and reproduce themselves. And that's something that that can be accounted for in terms of goal-directedness. It's just not a kind of goal-directedness that is directed outwards towards the environment. It's directed basically, if you want, inwards, or maybe according to some authors, I prefer it's directed towards survival or something like a similarly general goal. So if you want examples, homeostasis is also can be represented as a kind of goal-directed system. The normal state of the system, or the mid-range of the quantities that you are interested in, is the goal of the system, and under many different kinds of changes and perturbations and whatever, it can resiliently, persistently go back to that mid-range, to that normal state of the system. So that's also true about artificial systems, by the way. But what you don't see in artificial systems is this self-production or self-reproduction. Self-production is basically persistence in a lifetime. Reproduction is basically having offspring and going through the cycle of natural selection and stuff. So sex and death, you know. But that's a different issue, and it's way more complicated I think you can talk about self-production also in terms of goal-directedness, where the goal is survival, but that's another issue.
If there is only one available means, then your understanding of plasticity would not include a developmental element, such as the development of abilities towards a goal, such as in humans. Is that correct?
I'm not sure whether that's really devastating, but you're right. This is just you know, what I developed allows me to draw a basic distinction between intuitively non-goal directed systems and goal directed systems. Maybe many of your favorite examples of goal directed systems are way more complicated than my simple ones. I think that's okay, and it's not too surprising either. But I think the basic distinction it lies there. So you should attend really, really simple systems and try to find something that differentiates between simple physical systems and complex systems that are producing these more complex behaviors. And that was my sole goal, basically, to somehow able to exclude pendulums, compasses, and stuff like that people usually rely on arguing against behavioral-based goal-directedness.
We have a question from Tomasz. Would you agree that our instinctive perception of goal-directedness is also goal-directed? What goals do you think it could have?
Attention is a kind of system that definitely goal-directed. It follows things, and it really has this tendency of being plastic, and but maybe not in itself. I'm not sure, because instinctive perception of. I think you need more than your instinctive perception to be able to say that you are, sorry, to be able to say that some part of you is goal-directed, because that system, even though it seems to be quite flexible, plastic, might not be able to avoid obstacles. I'm not sure about this, but you require your motoric functions, your hands and legs and stuff like that, to be able to get around the obstacles to your perception. So maybe the instinctive perception of goal-directedness as an entity separated from all other abilities of human beings is not goal-directed in my sense of goal-directedness. Not in itself, but it's part of a system that is goal-directed, not goal-directed, and it's a really important part of it, that's for sure. So maybe, but to be able to give you a proper answer, I think I have to be able to somehow, single out this part of a human being, maybe in the nervous system, or I don't know how, to localize it and to somehow check whether my criteria apply to that part. And I'm not sure about that. And my first response is that probably not. I just don't see how it avoids obstacles in itself.
It's a question from Gabriela. Is a robot designed to avoid obstacles goal-directed according to your account?
Yes, it is. If you see a problem with that, I think you should try to formulate the issue. I don't see a problem with that. So yeah, I'm fine with that. There are really, really simple bacteria, for example, where basically not capable of doing really more than that in terms of behavior. So yeah, if we forget about their reproductive abilities, their self-production and their self-reproduction.
Yeah, I'm also being wondering about this issue, whether the fact that robots are classified as teleological on your view is problematic or not. But Gabriele, if you have any other.
But it's very interesting, isn't it? So why are we so puzzled about it? I know that usually we don't like this idea. We don't want them to be conscious. We don't want to attribute intentions to them, and because that's weird. Then we have to, give them rights and all that. But saying that they are teleological, maybe, or goal-directed, is a different thing. So if I agree with those who, no, I wouldn't say I agree. I can understand those who are skeptical about an approach that attributes goals to really simple systems like these. Because I think our basic idea of goal-directedness comes from basically our own experience with ourselves and other people. That's fair. This is really complicated. In our case, it's like, I don't know, nobody really understands basics of it. But that's a different problem, at least to my mind.
Sylvia asks, related to this, so it doesn't count that the robot's goal was put there by someone else?
Why would that be a problem?
Well, doesn't that make their goals extrinsic to them in some sense? Well, it only does what it was programmed to do, and what it was programmed to do was decided by someone else.
Yeah, okay. But if you are created by God, the same applies to us. So what then? We are not goal-directed because we are basically the puppets of God. It would be weird, wouldn't it be? So we are not.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, that depends on. I mean, the fact that God created you doesn't mean that God gave you the goals that you have. Maybe you have those intrinsically or naturally or whatever.
What do you mean by intrinsically there? So
well, maybe you choose your own goals or something like that if you have free will, or I don't know.
Yeah, if there's some really serious kind of free will where disability is not determined by natural causation and whatnot, then maybe. But that's a really strong view, isn't it? So if I'm basically a physical system, maybe created by God, then it's just the same with the robot. The ability to change my goals doesn't seem to be important for being goal-directed. So I think this is really helpful what you just said, Daniel. So, well, this is about changing your goals, setting your goals, not about being directed by them.
Yeah, that's a fair point. It's interesting. All right. Any last question, if there is one? If there isn't one, then thank you very much for your attention and time. Thank you, Gergely, for this extremely interesting session. And see you next time.
See you. Have a nice evening, everybody.